Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. In this one I want to discuss some common Avatar theories that you see out there and discuss how good or not they are. And before we get into the theories though, I do want to once again mention that I do have YouTube channel membership active on my channel. This is a great way for you guys to help support the channel, which is always important to keep it going and stuff like that. And I have two tiers on YouTube channel membership. There's a €1 a month tier and a €5 a month tier called Light Spirit and Avatar respectively. You get access to basically everything at the €1 tier, regardless of which tier you're a part of. So that is mainly access to these cool loyalty badges, which will appear next to your name in the comments and during live streams, as well as you having access to custom emojis, which I made for use on the channel, as you can see there. So you can use them again in the comments or in live streams again, but in this case in the chat, like in what you type out. And also you get access to member only posts and polls. That's more or less where this video topic idea more or less came from, is that okay, I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. What did the channel members, what sort of ideas did they have for theories? So I'd say a good over half of these theories I'm about to discuss did come from a member only post that I put up. So that's cool. And when I do have a situation where I don't have a topic for a week, I will often put up a post or a poll asking you guys what type of video you would like. So it's a cool way to help determine certain videos that might happen. The $5 tier, the main extra bonuses is you get everything there, but you also get access to any channel member exclusive videos I put up, which I make an effort to put up at least one a month, and then obviously the backlog is there as we kind of go forward. And then the other thing is that you will get thanked at the end of some of my videos. So if you want your name to appear at the end of a video, that's the tier to go for. But the main thing is that they do help to support the channel, which is important. So let's jump into these theories. So the first one here is a really obvious one. Saka is Suyin's father. Everyone has heard this one before, but is there anything to it? So obviously this comes basically from the idea that Toph has children with two different characters. Lin's father is a man named Kanto, who we don't really know much about. He's just a random character. That took one of those options out of the way, and so it kind of presented the idea that, okay, they told us one, why aren't they telling us the other one? Is there a story behind it? In the sense of, if Lin's father is not someone that's like important to us as a fan base, then surely that means Suyin's father actually is someone important. And it's kind of like, does that logic hold or not? It's a little unclear, but is there any value to this? Like, this is ultimately a Toph shipping situation. So it's interesting in that, like, it works in a way because, of course, Sokka's not around by the time we get to Korra. So he's not really there to say anything either way. The fact that we don't know if Sokka and Suki stay together past a certain point, because we don't see Sokka in Korra or Suki in Korra, means that this one kind of remains open, because Toph had a crush on Sokka and they always get on well together. So, there's a few ways you can connect the dots to make this happen. Ultimately, it's a theory that I suppose is going to remain until they answer the question. When they'll answer the question, who knows? There's a lot of these really obvious questions of just the ships for main characters that we don't know about. So it is weird that we don't know, but I think for now it's just a potential, because you can say, I think, just as much, use the exact same logic for Sokka for, say, the Duke. If you look at the comic and her interactions with the Duke, she has just as many sort of interesting, notable interactions with the Duke as she does with Sokka, in a way, from a romantic point of view. You could say Satoru, who in the comic she actually shows an attraction towards very, very clearly. It could be him. Or, it could be like the Lin Kanto situation, just someone random and not be particularly important. I get why the fandom talks about it, because shipping, and especially a major ship like this, is often a thing. But it also speaks to the idea of like, okay, she, the impression you get is that like neither relationship worked out. So would they be willing to do that? Have two of the characters get together and it not work out? You can, it's a toss up either way. Next up, Hama is why Kaya died. So this one might need a little bit of an explanation. So we're talking about, of course, Hama, the puppet master, the inventor of bloodbending, and Kaya as in Katara's mother. So we're saying Hama is the reason basically why Kaya died. Now the exact details of this theory goes like this. Hama, as we know from her backstory, was taken prisoner by the Fire Nation after a raid on the south. Hama is from the south. So she's in a Fire Nation prison where she invents bloodbending, uses it on the guard, and escapes. The guard opens up her prison and she walks free. Now, she doesn't kill that guard as far as we're aware, so obviously when she leaves, he gets up, alerts everyone, and has to explain that she used some sort of weird waterbending technique on me where she gained control over me. And suddenly, this creates this situation where the Fire Nation now suddenly views waterbenders as being exceptionally dangerous, more so than ever before. And probably the lack of information, them potentially not knowing that it requires the full moon or this or that, the restrictions on the technique means that they're suddenly like, we can't take waterbender prisoners anymore if they're capable of doing something like that, controlling us. So the idea of this theory is that Hama escaping changes the way the Fire Nation deal with waterbender prisoners. They go from taking prisoners to now no longer taking prisoners. So by the time you get to the Southern Raiders going out to the south to investigate the reports of another waterbender, Katara, and Kaya of course says that it was actually her, Yan-Ra, under the new orders, doesn't take prisoners. And the reason for that is because of what happened in the past with Hama. Thus, Hama is why Kaya died, because she forced the Fire Nation into a situation where they can't take waterbender prisoners anymore because they're too dangerous. This theory makes a lot of sense. I think it's one of the better constructed theories out there in that it all seems exceptionally reasonable and adds kind of extra depth to kind of everything going on without it feeling like, it's like bad that they didn't directly reference it within the body of the show. Now, I think that there's a few ways they could have done this, in the sense that in the Southern Raiders, Katara uses bloodbending, but she uses bloodbending on the kind of the other leader of the Southern Raiders, the guy who's active at the moment, but he wasn't involved in the past. She doesn't use bloodbending on Yan-Ra. Now, this is where it would have been interesting if they altered the episode and actually had it be that she uses bloodbending on Yan-Ra. And while he's like struggling being controlled by Katara, he's like, oh, this is it. I'm experiencing why our orders got changed all those years ago is because of this technique. And it would have been very interesting if you had a scene of like Katara sort of connecting the dots together and realizing Hama, who she met just a few episodes ago, is the reason why Kaya died. And how does she feel about that? Because she kind of dislikes Hama for turning her into a bloodbender, but now realizing that this technique is effectively what took her mother from her in a way. That the Fire Nation's sort of fear of bloodbending is what killed her mother. You can see how that could be an interesting thing. It might be a little bit too technical in that they wanted to focus more on just the personal dynamic between Katara and Yan-Ra and not have it be sort of interlaced with like, oh, Hama's involved as well and bloodbending is involved in it as well. It's up to you about whether you want the complex version or not, but it's nice that you can actually add this depth to it. So I think this one is actually quite good, whereas, the Saka Suyin one is just more of a full speculation, which, just going back to it for a second. The other thing that people often will say about this is that from like a visual point of view, like, oh, the skin tone of like Su Yin and a lot of Su Yin's kids feels more water tribe than Earth Kingdom. That means Saka is the father. There's a lot of situations like this in Avatar where just like, they try to create a variety across the different nations so that the people of each nation don't just look all identical. And especially the Earth Kingdom, I think you do have quite a big variety between, like, because it's such a giant location, and some places are closer to like the south, some places are closer to the north. So you can have kind of differences in people in the Earth Kingdom. I don't really buy into that too much, but anyway, we move on. Next, this is kind of a pretty bigger one. So it's a kind of 2-in-1 theory here, because they're both sort of related. The new airbenders in Korra Book 3 all were chosen as new airbenders because they have distant air nomad connections in their family history, and this relates to an Avatar theory that people have, that Ty Lee also has air nomad sort of lineage in her past. So this is one where I think the Ty Lee one is more of just people making a few visual connections along the line of the Sokka Su Yin's father type thing of like, oh, well, Ty Lee's personality is different and feels more like an air nomad. Like her hair color, her eye color, and just everything about her just doesn't feel quite Fire Nation, and so there must be a connection to one of the other nations. Now, there's no, beyond that visual connection, there's no real, there's nothing particularly behind it in terms of, oh yeah, this is absolutely confirmed, in the sense that like she's from a noble Fire Nation family, which would mean that if she does have air nomad, genetics, I suppose, in her family, it's either quite a ways back or it's like very subtle in there. To me, that the fact that she's from a noble family would suggest that it's a pretty, kind of like, it's a Fire Nation family, and there's not really a lot extra kind of going on there from a bloodline point of view, and it's just, she's a bit different. There can be differences between the different Fire Islands that each Fire Nation clan sort of descends from. So the Ty Lee one is like cool, like fair enough. Like if that ends up being true, I wouldn't really have a problem with it. But right now, it's not a theory I'm particularly attached to, because I don't really think there's too much really like behind it necessarily, just because of some kind of visual stuff about like her eye color and so on. As for the top bit though, the idea that everyone who was chosen by harmonic convergence happening, who created the new airbenders in Korra Book 3, that happened to everyone because of an air nomad connection in the family history. I find that to be an interesting one, in the sense of like, I see why people want to make that connection, with the idea for both of these ultimately being that there's no way that the air nomads were like utterly wiped out. There had to have been a sense of sort of hidden air nomads from families that existed during this time period, and people who escaped and had families like after the initial genocide and stuff like that. So I get the idea of people really wanting this sense of sort of like undercover air nomads that kind of have lost their way, and this spiritual event sort of brought that back to the forefront. My interpretation had always just been that because this happened because of an event like harmonic convergence, an event that happens every 10,000 years, it seeks to restore harmony to the world by converging, everything back to harmony. That it is more of a random choice. That what better way to actually bring back the air nomads and make sure it stays back than just randomly making non-benders into airbenders, rather than specifically highlighting like, how does this energy-based event target people who are like inclined to be airbenders, versus just a random selection of non-benders across the world suddenly become airbenders. I think that fits just like a little bit better, just because I feel like if there was some sort of a connection, they would have brought it up at some point. Like the problem with, I think, trying to overly connect everything to, oh, they have to have an air nomad history, is that at some point someone would have had airbending. Enough years have passed where surely if there was someone who was like related to an air nomad, an airbender down the line, surely someone would have been born and shown airbending at some point, but it hasn't happened. Yes, you can make the argument that, you know, airbending sort of requires spirituality to a degree, and if they're growing up in the Earth Kingdom, they're not particularly spiritual, so they don't have airbending. But again, that sort of implies that you can't have bending without spirituality, and most kids, I suppose, showcase their bending at a relatively young age, and, you know, kids that young wouldn't really understand the concept of spirituality all that much. So, you know, there comes a point at which it's just like, I don't really buy it, because I think there would have been some sense of rumors of other airbenders being out there, but there wasn't. So that's why I do think it is more of a case of like, it's just random people became air nomads, and because they are from all scattered across the world, they have to adapt to the air nomad culture. Otherwise, I think you would have seen one or two people go like, oh, this actually makes a little bit of sense because my grandfather was an airbender or something like that. But that didn't happen as far as we're aware. So we'll see if they ever tell a story that sort of relates to that in any way, but that's just my thoughts on it. Next, Saka died defending Korra against the Red Lotus. So this all stems from one of the biggest tease moments in The Legend of Korra, which is that they reveal that Korra was nearly kidnapped when she was very young, like 4 or 5. Unalaq basically organized a kidnapping attempt of Korra using the Red Lotus members from Book 3, but obviously this took place prior to the series. So again, it was Pali, Ghazan, Minghua, and Zahir, prior to becoming an airbender, all attacked Korra basically where she lived. It wasn't the compound at this point, it was just Korra at home in the Southern Water Tribe. They tried to kidnap her, and Korra was defended by Sokka, Tenzin, Zuko, and her father Tonraq. So it's this incredible battle between like those 4 notable characters against the Red Lotus members, and apparently the Red Lotus lost this battle, which is why they're in prison at the start of Book 3. Sokka we don't see in Korra. We know he is dead as of the start of Korra. So connect the dots. Maybe he died in this fight. We know the Red Lotus are willing to kill, and that they're very dangerous combatants. Maybe Sokka died in the middle of this fight. This is one of the ones where I feel like if this was the case, I think they would have said it. I just don't see any way how this is said to her, and it's not mentioned at all that, like, I think Tenzin is the one who actually says it to her, that like Tenzin doesn't mention that like a relative of his died, that like someone who Korra would have a connection to because of course Katara like trained her, and this is Katara's brother. I'm sure that would have been told if that was the case. So it's one of those things where like I like this idea of a theory, but I don't think it actually is the case, just because why wouldn't they have said it? And I think that's a few of these that we've already gone through, and we'll get to a few others. It's just like, that sounds cool, like, but again, they didn't show the fight. And my impression would be just that, yeah, none of the Red Lotus members were killed. It doesn't seem like Zuko, Tonraq, or Tenzin like mentioned receiving any giant injury or anything like that. So why would Sokka be the only sort of combatant who went down in that fight? But still, it's a cool idea. Why don't we know the answer? Next up, Azula appears in Beginnings in Korra. So this theory is basically that Azula is the shaman healer who helps Korra in Beginnings Part 1 and at the end of Beginnings Part 2. So this is that old woman who, is part of the tribe that Korra washes up on, and this is apparently Azula. To me, this is just not the case. Azula isn't in Korra, that woman is not Azula. That is the shaman healer of the Bonte tribe. We know for a fact that that's where Korra washes up. It's basically Bonte Island. It's the Bonte tribe, this ancient Fire Nation tribe who, are related to like the Fire Sages. Like most of the sages in the world ultimately stem back to this tribe. That the reason this shaman healer has a special firebending technique is because it's the Bonte tribe special spiritual firebending technique. So this is not Azula. And again, if it was Azula, why wouldn't they mention it? Like, in a series where they know people are desperate for these references, and they otherwise do make references to the ATLA cast, why would they hide stuff like this? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, is there any possible way Azula goes from where she ends up at the end of Smoke and Shadow, the last time we saw her, and then years later as part of the Bonte tribe? I suppose theoretically there is a way that happens, but I don't necessarily view that as being like where her story goes, like that she joins the Bonte tribe somehow. Why? How does that happen? And theoretically becomes one of their leaders. Not sure I necessarily buy that. So that's just a theory I see from time to time, but I don't really buy into it. Next, Lavabenders come from having firebender and earthbender parents. So there's a lot of speculation about lavabending. Of course, it's a special technique. Everyone loves to talk about it. And the speculation, this one basically comes from like Bolin. That's like pretty much the only reason that this comes from, is that in ATLA, it clearly was presented more as a firebending technique, because it was like you only saw avatars really use it. Like Roku used it, Kyoshi used it, Avatar Zito, when we saw him, he was the fire representative avatar, and his technique that he used to show the avatar state was making volcanoes erupt, lava bending. Clearly they thought it was firebending back in ATLA, but when they came into Korra and decided to give a normal bender lava bending, they clarified he was an earthbender, and that was Gazan. We have since gone on to have Bolin, who's an earthbender, be a lava bender, as well as Sun, more recently in the Toph Beifong Metal Bending Academy comic, also be an earthbender lava bender. None of those three characters showcase any sense of firebending whatsoever, beyond the fact that lava is hot. That's the only actual connection in any way of lava bending to fire from a sort of bending point of view, is just that it's hot. And I don't really agree with that. Part of why I don't like this theory is basically that, to me, one of the most fundamental rules in Avatar is that you can't have a bender born who is a double or triple or quadruple element bender. That the way Wan became the first Avatar is a bunch of very specific and unique circumstances coming together perfectly. Circumstances that are almost impossible to replicate. For one, you need line turtles, which aren't around anymore. Two, you can only merge the human and spirit together to create the avatar of being capable of holding all four elements at harmonic convergence, which only happens every 10,000 years. And then two, of course, you need the friendship between the human and spirit, which typically isn't particularly possible. So a lot of this stuff doesn't happen. Like Unalaq was able to get to a point where like two of these things happened. Vatu was ultimately willing to merge with him, and he with Vatu. Harmonic convergence happened, but no line turtles to give them extra bendings, just that they had water bending from Unalaq. So this, to me, gets too close to the idea that it is actually possible through like basically selective breeding almost to create benders of multiple elements or create benders with specific techniques. And so I don't like at all the idea that this earthbending technique, a special earthbending technique, is related to firebending at all. Because you can make the point of just like, oh, but no, it's earthbending, it's just that the other parent is fire. But at some point you are trying to suggest the idea that the fire aspect plays a role in the earthbending, and that I don't agree with, because the way bending works is that there is a power of fire, power of air, power of earth, and so on. We're not mixing and matching here. We're just saying that lava bending is a high level earthbending technique that avatars can use, because guess what avatars are capable of doing? Using the avatar state, which boosts their powers, which allows them access to techniques normal benders can't actually do. And lava benders are just special benders born with a little bit more power than your typical bender, which is why they're special, which is why combustion benders are special, and why the Yukon family was special for being able to bloodbend at all times. So that's my issue with this theory. I get where it comes from, but it then gets into what I think is going off into, I think, territory that I can't agree with, which is well, what if someone was born with 2 elements? Which I don't think they'll ever do, and I get why some people think that's cool, but we don't want to do that because the avatar is meant to be unique for a reason. So that's my thoughts on this. I do think it is more of a case of just randomness, that, you know, what is there a connection between Sun, Bolin, and Gazan? Is there a specific connection between, say, Pali and Combustion Man? Not particularly, really. So it is just a case of, like, there's a random chance that you get these special benders capable of performing these techniques. Now, it would be interesting to see, like, if Bolin goes on to have children, if his child, if they're a bender, was a lava bender kind of just by default, and we get sort of a lava bending line there that starts in the same way that, like, Yukon is obviously implied to just be a guy who happened to be born with special blood bending. His kids also had that technique. You know, it's just that interesting idea. But anyway, we move on. Next, lightning redirection can be performed by anyone. Now, this is not so much a theory as a misconception that I just recently came across in the fandom, that I'd never heard about before until basically last week, which was that the Avatar social media channels put up this sub-bending chart on all of their social medias, and it included, as part of the fire section, lightning redirection. And a lot of people in the comments seem to be taking issue with that. Not for the reason I thought they were. I thought they'd be making the point that, like, well, you included lightning already in the fire section. Why the need for lightning and lightning redirection? They're just 2 techniques of the same, sub-bending, basically. And then the thing that I saw was like, whoa, I never knew that this was sort of a relatively common thing that people think. That lightning redirection apparently can just be learned by anyone. It's not a fire bending technique as such. It is a technique that allows anyone to redirect lightning. Now, I'm sure some of you are already kind of screaming about the issues with this, and I ultimately agree with you. Now, I think the reason why people view it this way is because of the way Iroh explains it. And I don't think it's that Iroh kind of explains this badly or anything like that. I think it's just people kind of running with something without going into the details well enough. And that is that, of course, he explains that he learned this technique after studying waterbenders and how their philosophy of waterbending can be applied to firebending. And I think a lot of people take it that, like, oh, well, he's a firebender, but he's basically trying to do a waterbending technique. So it's just a technique anyone can do. And I think it's people taking the whole idea of, like, it's waterbending philosophy applied to a firebending technique and taking it a little bit too far. That the bending forms are too interlinked with their philosophy, when it's like, no, it's not. Sure, firebending is typically the most offensive one. That doesn't mean Zhang Zhang is not firebending just because he does defensive firebending. It's just a different style. The masters are the ones who are best capable of utilizing stuff they've learned from elsewhere. So in this case, realizing that, oh, typically firebending doesn't really involve that sort of idea of redirecting or, like, you know, kind of fluidly wrapping fire around your body and stuff like that. It just doesn't. It's more of a, direct punch kick, and you directly block or kind of smother your opponent's attacks. You don't like step to the side, swing the fire around and send it back like waterbending does. But what if you did do it that way? That is a good way to handle the idea of redirecting lightning. And this is where we get into the idea that even though it's lightning redirection, it's still lightning bending. Because Iroh explains the technique as that you take it in one hand, like through the fingers. And then he specifically tells Zuko, this is the key thing with it. When you take it in, make sure you pass the energy through your stomach, not through your heart. Now, if it's a technique anyone can use, that means you don't have control over the lightning. But Iroh, in explaining the technique to Zuko, explains that you can control where it goes, meaning that bending is still involved. Zuko can't generate lightning because that is an actual technical technique that you need to separate energies to create lightning. But Zuko is capable of bending lightning once it's sort of like out as such. So by absorbing it into his body, he can direct it through his stomach, which they describe as being the sea of chi. So you sort of contain it within your energy center in your body. And then the way they showcase lightning redirection is obviously that you hold the lightning within yourself and then you fire it out. So it's not just a case where you act as a sort of like almost boomerang for the lightning, and it's just you take it in and immediately has to come out. Sure, that's the way it looks when Iroh does it first. But once it's explained as a technique, especially like when Zuko does it, you clearly see that like the lightning is fully within him. Like it's not still in the process of being taken in by him. It's now just Zuko has the lightning within him, and he shoots it out of his other hand. He bends it out of his body, out of his hand. So it's definitely a technique where you bend lightning. Lightning is a subset of firebending, so you're still firebending. So only firebenders can perform this technique. And I don't get where it's mentioned anywhere that this is a technique open to anyone who isn't a firebender at all. Now, I can imagine ways where certain benders you can create certain techniques that might help you to redirect lightning, but you are never bending it or performing it in the exact same way. So, maybe there's some sort of a way where you can use like maybe physics to your advantage, and like, you get lucky that if you take in lightning as a non-lightning bender, and you're wearing the right equipment or whatever, you can just act as a sort of like a channel, a conduit for the lightning. But to do it in the exact same way that we see the firebenders do it, who can do redirection, definitely not. Next up, we have this. The Fire Nation used the dragons to attack the air temples, and the dragons' response to being used this way is why Sozin started the tradition of hunting them for glory. They lost faith in their masters after being used to destroy a nation. So there's a few sort of theories involved here, and this all relates to the fact that we don't know a lot about the Air Nomad genocide. We do know that it was explained by Aang that the Air Nomads have a good natural defense at all of their temples because they're built basically on the sides of mountains. So they're sort of naturally impassable for the most part, especially like if you're leading a giant army to wipe out all of the people at that temple. They're pretty good places to defend in that you have to go like all the way around the back to get into this temple, or there's one pass up this mountain. How did they do it? Sure, the comet was around, but how exactly did they get up there in such numbers that they effectively did wipe out most of the air nomads and only had to hunt down a few stragglers after the fact? Well, dragons, of course. That's the obvious method of, like, with technology in the Fire Nation being nowhere near air transport. Dragons were their method of that. And we know from Roku, we know from Sozin, they had their own dragons that, were their animal friends, basically, as far as we're aware. We don't know the details on that, where they got them from, how much access people or which families have access to dragons. There's a lot about that era that we don't particularly know about, but the point remains that two, I suppose, relatively high up people in the Fire Nation did have access to dragons, and the idea would be that when the dragons were around much more prevalently, more families, I guess, would have access to dragons as well. There's more of a sense of the people of the Fire Nation living with dragons, I guess. And yeah, why wouldn't they use flying animals? Which, one question you would also have is that do the dragons also get like augmented by the comet? My guess would be yes, because like the dragons are clearly bending fire, in that they can create like fire tornadoes and stuff like that. The badger moles, when they earthbend, clearly just earthbend. They're not just strong animals capable of breaking earth. They can properly bend earth. So I do think the animals are like, effectively doing bending. It may be more of a sort of natural thing, but I do think there's the connection is there for a reason. So dragons would be an excellent use to, obviously you have to counter the fact that there'd be sky bison around and so on. What better way to combat that than with dragons also augmented by fire? But you've got to assume that like dragons are like, the bending animals are all sort of almost implied to be much more intelligent type of animals than a lot of the other ones. They'd have a reaction to something like this being used for such a brutal act. And if, from Sozin's perspective, his own dragon stops listening to him or betrays him from like Sozin's point of view, yeah, he'd completely turn. He's already, basically betrayed his best friend. What's betraying his animal companion? I can definitely see something like this potentially being a thing, in that I definitely think some aspect of this general idea is true, of the dragons being used in the attacks during the genocide, or the dragons feeling a sense of betrayal to what happened with what the Fire Nation did to the air nomads, that sort of a thing. Because yeah, Sozin going from having a dragon of his own to being like, actually, no, fight dragons, kill dragons and earn a title, become glorious by defeating one of these legendary animals. Why would he suddenly do that? Why would he suddenly realize like there's no value in dragons anymore, we don't need them anymore? And it probably was some sense of we've just hurt the dragons by using them to do this. They're powerful, let's not let them turn on us, let's turn on them first. I can see something like that being involved, kind of somewhere down the line. But I think that's pretty much where I'm going to kind of wrap things up here for now. Again, this topic came about pretty short notice, so I just had enough time to send out the sort of post to the channel members to get some of these ideas. But the idea will be that I'm absolutely willing to do a second one of these. So if you have any other Avatar theories that you've seen, or maybe have yourself along the lines of these ones that you would like to see me discuss, definitely let me know in the comments section below. But yeah, just to end once again on the note of you can become a member of the channel here by becoming a Light Spirit or Avatar level member on the channel, depending on what perks you would like. But that is the best way to support the channel, and you can help out on deciding ideas for future videos, specific topics or ideas for videos and so on, as well as some other perks. So that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.